So before we start our build, first and foremost, we're going to need some tools to build with. Logical, really. So what tools do we need for this particular build? Well, firstly, we start off with a hex driver, 1.5mm, because on micros we're mostly working with M2 screws. Very rarely do we use M3. So 1.5 is normally the driver that you need for a M2 screw. So we've got that one there. Then obviously a soldering iron, because we're going to do some soldering. Now this is the only problem with doing a small build, is the small soldering pads. So if you do have some issues with that, I can highly recommend you get something like this. This is like a practice board. They're not very expensive, and they have soldering pads from very large down to very, very small. So practice with one of these. If you feel a bit nervous, a bit anxious maybe about doing some small soldering, there's a couple of these available. This one is quite straightforward, just with all the different pads on both sides. But I'd practice on it, but also I'd say practice not just doing one wire and then going and moving on to the next hole, but doing a couple close together, because the main issue you can get with soldering is breaching pads, going across a pad so that the two pads are joined, because you've not been quite as neat with the solder as you could have been. So I'd highly recommend getting a board like this and then doing loads of little soldering bits of wire, offcuts, whatever you've got lying about, and all the little pads, and also the big pads. You may think they're quite straightforward, but there's a technique to soldering on larger pads if you move on doing bigger builds later on. Getting a good coverage of solder and a good join on a big pad can be quite awkward as well. Almost as awkward sometimes as trying to get a good solder joint on a really tiny little pad. So I'd recommend getting a board like that, and that will help you if you're a bit nervous about soldering. As opposed to the soldering iron, well, this is TS100, probably one of the best soldering irons you can get. Certainly for the price, you can't get anything anywhere near the quality of this for the sort of £30–40 that one of these would cost. So I'd highly recommend the TS100 or the TS80, and I believe there's another soldering iron that I can't remember the name of, which is very similar to the TS100 but a little bit cheaper and quite readily available as well. So you perhaps want to think about those, but certainly the TS100 is what I'd recommend. Next, some wire cutters. We've got wire, we need to cut it. Good set of wire cutters is always useful, especially ones that work really well. If you get a cheap pair, they sometimes don't meet quite as well in the middle, and the cuts aren't very good and they're a bit mangled, or these get little dents in them because the metal of the actual cutters is quite soft. These seem to be quite a good pair. Had these for a while and they seem quite good to me, but just get a reasonable quality, not a really cheap rubbishy pair that might break or might not give a nice clean cut, which is what you need. Wire cutters. Obviously, if we're going to be soldering, we need some solder, and these little tubes that sometimes this solder comes in could be really useful, so you can hold it a bit easier, and soldering of having to have a big reel of it. Obviously a big reel is a bit cheaper, but this is easier to hold, especially if you're working in tight confined spaces, as we will be soldering up a little micro. So soldering on. Electrical tape can always be useful. We've got a selection here of screwdriver bits that might be useful as well. Could come in handy, especially if the hex bit we're trying to drive in is a bit smaller, 1.5 or a weird size. Sometimes they can be 1.3 or something like that. Really odd size heads sometimes you need for certain M2 screws. So I'd recommend getting a little selection pack of that, not very expensive as well. Craft knife can be very useful, and a set of tweezers as well. Something to perhaps get in and hold wire very delicately while you're soldering. If you can't get your fingers quite in to hold the wire, you don't want to get burnt. Obviously soldering irons are hot, you don't want to get too close to the tip with your fingers. You can use a nice set of tweezers instead, like this, quite easy to get hold of, to hold the wire in place as you're soldering. So that's a very useful gadget as well. And also we might want to get a couple of selection packs, M2 screws and sort of screws and standoffs, that sort of thing can be very, very useful. So there we have some basic tools. We might need to use some other tools, and if I do use any other tools apart from these during the build, I'll mention them and bring to your attention. But this is our basic toolkit that we'll need, and this will help us to build, and it will also help us if we need to do any maintenance on our quads after a period of time. So here we have our equipment. So then what parts then we're going to be using this equipment on to assemble to make our little quad? Well, let's have a look at that next. So let's have a look at our parts that we're going to build our quad out of. Firstly, our frame. This is the Racer X Twiglet frame. So this is slightly smaller than their original Racer X frame, designed for sort of 2.5-inch 65mm props, lightweight, tiny little flyer, but with the similar design to the original one. So quite a strong frame, good quality carbon, nice quality parts. This one, you can see, has got a blue canopy. That's because Racer X have joined up with Beta FPV, and Beta FPV colour, as you know, or maybe you don't know, but is blue. So that's why we now got blue canopies, and you can buy this from or through directly Beta FPV, as well as other places that you can buy it from. So a nice frame, good quality, will make a nice little quad. So we've got a canopy, we've got a frame, we've got battery strap and everything else we need in there, which is excellent to start with. So what do you need next? We need our flight controller. Now this is the flight controller from a company called Jhmcu, Jhmcu. Not sure if that's you pronounce it correctly, but yeah, it's from that company, Jhmcu. Recently brought out some interesting whoop balls. This is one of their earlier ones. This does 1 and 2S, but it's a 5-amp ESC, so we need to keep that in mind. So it will do 2S, which is the build we want to do, but it's only 5 amps. So that means we have to be careful with the next item that we need, which is our motors. Now these are some GEP RC motors, as you can see, 1103s, 8000 kV. So really perfect for this build. 2 3S, even though this won't be a 3S, we're only going to do 2S, but the motors can take the 2S. Really nice quality motors, excellent, and they work well because they don't go over the 5-amp rating, so they'll work well with the ESC on this particular board. In fact, I know they work well because on my little 2S Toothpick build here, we've got the motors and we've got that flight controller. I've not had a single problem with this one, so we know that they work well together. So that's our motors and the flight controller. Next, a camera, Foxeer camera. This is, we can focus on that light. The Foxeer, it's the Razor Nano, so a little cheap camera, not very expensive, nice little budget option, great little camera for the money. You can't really go wrong with Foxeer, Runcam as well, the Nano 2, excellent little camera. Caddx also produce small cameras, but their quality not quite as good in my opinion. Still good, but I'd say Foxeer or Runcam are better for quality in that respect. Though if you're on a budget, the Caddx cameras are certainly cheaper, and the quality can be, you know, not too bad. But I'd say these Foxeer or Runcam have better quality, so we've gone for the Foxeer camera there. So that's our camera. Next up, we need our VTX, and here we have our VTX. This is the Triangle, I think it's from Eachine. It's a DVR as well, so you put a SD card in it, your VTX, so you'll be able to see as you fly along, and as long as you press record before you take off, and then don't forget to press the button again, otherwise you'll lose the footage when you land before you take the lipo out. And you should get some nice footage with this as well. So this is our sort of little VTX, sort of whoop style VTX with DVR that we'll be using on this build. Obviously if you go for a non-DVR version, it'll be a bit lighter, but it shouldn't affect the weight too much. Hopefully we'll get a reasonable weight. 70 to 75 grams would be excellent, so we'll see how it goes with that. Then we have a small little receiver. This is a little FlySky receiver because I like FlySky. Most of my models are FlySky, so it's a little receiver. Very lightweight, very small, perfect for our little build. So we'll put that on as well. What else have we got? We've got this antenna here, which I'm thinking of using, which probably will use on this build, from ORT. The Micro V, so this should give us a very good quality picture on this little VTX antenna that we've got here. Better than what comes with normal VTX, this little sort of linear whip antenna. This should give us much better range, better quality of picture as well. So we don't have to go for this, but I wanted to use this and see what it was like. So we're going to put this on this build. We should get a really good quality picture. ORT all make excellent antennas, so we've got that as well, but that's not something we have to use. And then finally our props. Now we said this particular frame that we're using, the Twiglet, this can take a 65mm prop. In fact, it comes with some 65mm props, so it's quite a lot larger than these 2023 props we've got here. 65mm is more akin to 2.5 inch at 2.5. They're 25 size prop. But here we have these 2023. Now, Gemfan make excellent props, and my early builds from a couple of years ago, I used the 2035 props and little 2-inch builds, and they were brilliant. But these obviously using the latest technology, they've changed the design, the blades looking a lot more like the slightly bigger brothers, sort of 50, the 50, 5143.3, that kind of profile of the blade, obviously showing their technology and how they've advanced. So I'm going to put some 2-inch props on this, and the motors should quite like the 2-inch props. We wouldn't want to put a 2.5-inch tri-blade on these motors, I wouldn't have thought. Obviously with my Toothpick build, we've got a 2.5-inch or 65mm bi-blade prop, but with 3 propellers that might increase our amp draw and might not make it as efficient, because I can get quite a lot of flight time out of the Toothpick there. So with these slightly smaller props, they're 2-inch, and obviously quite a shallow pitch, which is nice, gives a good flight feel, and good economy on the battery draw and things like that, so we should get nice flight time to this. But we'll see how it goes. I've not used these props before, so I'm interested to see how they go as well for our little sort of park racing sort of freestyle build that we're going to make. So that's all of our parts. So let's now move on to the first stage of our build, which will be in the next video.